Welcome to a very special episode of the Bears Talk podcast. I cannot tell you how excited I am for tonight's special guest, the managing editor of Bears Wire, Alyssa Barbieri. We're going to bring her on in a few minutes. If you're a Bears fan, if you're on Bears Twitter or pretty much Googling any story Bears related, you know who Alyssa is. She is first. She's the fastest. She's the most prolific Bears writer in the space right now. I can't wait to talk to her not only about the Bears, but about her process and how she basically has risen through the industry like no one I've ever seen before. It's been incredible. We have a lot of Bears stuff to talk about today. We got Roquan Smith is back. The Bears are 2-0 in the preseason. Matt Eberflus said the Bears starters are going to play for the first half of the Bears preseason finale, which will make the game fun, but has some fans a little anxious and nervous about the injuries. We'll talk to Alyssa about all of that and more coming up in a few seconds on the Bears Talk podcast. Before we bring Alyssa on, I got to get some business out of the way, right? Make sure you head over to Apple Podcasts, subscribe to the Bears Talk podcast, head over to our YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe. I'd love it if you head to Twitter, throw me a follow at Bryan Perez NFL. And of course, if you follow Bears Talk over on Twitter at the Bears Talk, you'll get all the latest news and updates about the Chicago Bears, about this podcast. And sometimes we have some fun banter about football in general as well. But as I said in the preview, Alyssa Barbieri is going to join us here in a few seconds. And I'm telling you, Bears fans, if you're not following her, make sure you are on Twitter at Alyssa Barbieri. She'll give you all her specifics on where you can find her in a minute. And who am I to do the sales pitch? Let's bring Alyssa in right now. Alyssa, welcome to the Bears Talk podcast.
Thank you so much for having me and for orchestrating this reunion. I mean, it's been a while since we've done a podcast together, but it's always a great time.
It has been a while, and for those of you who may not know, I spent a good chunk of time over at Bears Wire as well. It was one of my favorite times as a Bears writer. I got to work with all the great people over at the USA Today Wire Network under the sports media group there. And Alyssa and I spent a lot of time together covering the Bears from all angles as co-workers at Bears Wire. And it's been so remarkable to watch Alyssa rise through the industry. In my opinion, for my money, Alyssa is the best at what she does. And I'm not just saying that because she's right next to me in the box here on the podcast. I don't care if you're in Chicago and you're on the Bears beat. I don't care if you write for any of the big newspapers or a big media company. Alyssa is going to beat you to the story, and she's going to cover it better. Alyssa, give the listeners here a little bit of your background. Let them know where you kind of come from and how you became a Bears fan and what this rise through Bears content creation has been like for you, because it's been an incredible upward trajectory that, to be honest, I don't see it stopping anytime soon. So let the listeners, especially, look, women in sports is a thing, right? And to see someone like you rise through the ranks the way you have based on ability and talent and passion has been such probably an inspiration for all the little girl Bears fans out there who want to break into this space. So let the listeners know, how did you do it? How did you get to this place? And, you know, what maybe some of your goals are moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, in a weird way, I guess I can thank hockey for kind of getting me into sports. That was my first love at age 7 and kind of was just fixated on sports. And then when I was in high school, I was like, wow, you know, you can actually get paid to write about sports for a living. So I got my degree in journalism, but it was difficult finding a job coming out of college. So I did some teaching for a few years and then, you know, saw a tweet over on Twitter from the Bears Wire from one Bryan Perez over here asking for contributors. And I just kind of went for it. And it'd been a while since I'd written about sports, and it just felt good to kind of get back into it. And I've always been someone who is competitive in everything that I do. It's just in me. And I guess, especially being a woman in this industry too, you have to work twice as hard. And I just don't have a chill button. I just kind of go nonstop. That's what people always say about me. They're like, how do you do it? Do you sleep? I'm like, well, the secret is caffeine. I have plenty of caffeine. That helps me. Also the inner drive and the passion, like you mentioned. I mean, people like us wouldn't be doing what we're doing if we didn't love it, right? That's why you want to get into a career like this, is because you love writing about sports. Also helps that, you love the team that you're covering, which is just pretty amazing. So, I mean, it's been crazy that, it started, as a contributor role. And then, once you moved on to NBC Sports and really you just been like the best champion for me. And you gave me so many opportunities, and it's just been really great. And I'm so thankful to you. And, getting to step into that role. And then now, I get to do it for a full-time gig with USA Today Sports. So, I mean, it doesn't feel like it's slowing down anytime soon, but, right now it's a good place to be.
You are the perfect example, in my opinion, of how the passionate fan, as well as the talented writer, when those two things kind of mix together, the untapped potential, and you never know how far those two skills can bring someone like you, like me, like all the other content creators that have had a little bit of it's maybe a combination of luck, hard work, effort, passion, being prepared, and taking advantage of an opportunity. That's why over at Bears Talk, what I've tried to do is create this Bears Talk social network, which allows Bears fans to sign up. If you pay for basically like a cup of coffee every month and do a premium membership, you unlock the ability at Bears Talk to cover the Bears however you want to. You can write 10 articles a day. You can write 1 article a month. You could be long form. You could be a quick hitting writer. Bottom line is you can get your name out there. And as Alyssa alluded to a moment ago, when I was doing Bears Wire and I just was looking for some help, Alyssa responded to me, and I knew right away. Like, I knew right away there was something different about her. About her. And once she came on staff, I remember talking to our mutual friend Neil Coulong and saying, "Look, man, superstar in the making. And your work effort, your work ethic, your hustle has been honestly something that all aspiring writers should shoot for." But you're like the old analogy, right? You shoot for the moon, maybe you'll grab a few stars along the way. I don't think anybody will get to Alyssa's level, but you might grab a couple of stars along the way. And talk about grabbing some stars. Let's talk about the Chicago Bears, right? Enough of the reunion love fest, all that stuff. All that stuff's out of the way, right?
We could be here forever doing that.
Exactly. Let's talk about this team, the Chicago Bears, who 7 days a week, almost 24 hours a day you're covering. I'm doing the same thing on my end. We have been through a few preseasons here since we've been covering the Bears during the same kind of timeline, the Mitch Trubisky, Matt Nagy era most notably. This preseason feels a little different, doesn't it? The Matt Eberflus, the Justin Fields, even the Ryan Poles in the front office. The preseason feels a little different than what we've been used to from the past regime, the past quarterback tenure, the last 4 years or so, kind of like that 4 years slice, or a high school career is 4 years, a college career is 4 years for some people. We went through essentially that kind of timeline with the previous regime. We're going through the first, maybe the honeymoon period now with Eberflus, Poles, and Fields. What do you think has been the biggest difference so far between what we went through with Nagy and what we're kind of just entering now with Eberflus?
I just think, I think there's a vast difference between the two when you just kind of look at it. I always use this analogy that with Matt Nagy, he was like the super cool substitute teacher, right? Where he wanted to be the cool guy and wanted to please his players. And now Matt Eberflus comes into the picture, and he's like that strict discipline teacher that is going to tell you how it is. You're going to follow the rules. There's not going to be any chaos happening. And I just kind of even getting that in the preseason so far, you're seeing it with his preparation and just how he's approaching the preseason. Like, obviously, we've seen Matt Nagy in the past, wanting to rest his starters, which, I mean, I'm a little concerned about, going into that last preseason game. But, you see Matt Eberflus really wanting his team to be better. You see him setting those clear expectations and standards that the players are really rallying around, which is really important when you have this young team that's mostly new, right? There's a lot of new faces. That's why they had the last names on the back of jerseys. So I just feel like with Matt Eberflus, even though we really don't know where this is going, like you said, we're still in the honeymoon phase, but I just feel like the adults are in the room. So I feel like I can relax a little bit. We'll see where this goes. He could end up flaming out too. We don't know. But right now, I just feel like he has a really good handle on how he's approaching the season, how he's approaching the preseason. And he's really, and I hate using this word because it's something that Bears fans really hated, but when Matt Nagy and, Ryan Pace talked about the collaboration, right? It actually feels like it's a thing that's happening, though, with this regime. It's not just a word they're throwing out there. So it sounds like they're all, on the same page and everything's working and bouncing ideas off each other. So I mean, I just feel like he's more prepared. And yeah, that's my first impression of him. And I think that the players are really responding to that. And I feel like having a coach like Matt Eberflus is a difference between, maybe winning 4 games and maybe even pushing for 6 or 7 wins, right? Because the Bears have a favorable schedule. I think that they're a team that a lot of people think are going to be bottom of the barrel, like the whole worst team in the league thing, which is kind of ridiculous. But when you have a head coach like Matt Eberflus, I think he's someone who can help you get those extra wins because his players are going to play for him. And he's really setting the standard this early in training camp and the preseason. So, I've been encouraged with what I've seen from Eberflus so far.
I love the substitute teacher analogy, right? Because a lot of times, and with all due respect to substitute teachers, sometimes they're just kind of taking that job as a holdover till they get to their actual career. And sometimes maybe they're not even totally qualified in some instances to be in a classroom. Matt Nagy felt overmatched, like the job was too big for him at times. We saw in plenty of press conferences after games that he was searching for the whys. He never had an answer. He never had a solution. He made things seem just more complicated than they needed to be, or even in some ways simplified it too much, right? Whereas Matt Eberflus, you would think, one of the things that has jumped out at me so far through his first couple of months on the job in reality is his level of professionalism. It's like he's been here before. He feels to me like a head coach who had a previous stop somewhere, maybe won a Super Bowl, and is now here in Chicago, maybe second or third time going through a head coaching gig. It seems like he's been here before. Even the way he talks to the media, he flashes that little smile sometimes. You could tell, there's instances when he is maybe a little frustrated by questions, but he's not necessarily letting that show. And he always has an answer, an intelligent answer. He's able to articulate his thoughts in a way that is so refreshing. And I don't know if it's normal, like he's just league average head coach speak, and we're just coming out of like the post-traumatic Nagy syndrome where we've dealt with this bizarre 4-year cycle of Matt Nagy not being able to essentially provide any substance in press conferences. And now we're actually getting that. So maybe we're overreacting to the positive, overreacting to essentially minimum competence level. But the Bears have that. And that to me now at least puts them in position to be competitive. We've seen Alyssa in the preseason. One thing that jumps out at me is mistake-free football, right? Backups playing really, really hard, playing with a high level of intensity. This whole hits philosophy that Matt Eberflus has, it's very real. You can see these guys are hustling. They want to make a positive impression on the new coaching staff. It's a deep roster, which is part of why they're 2-0 right now in the preseason. You talk about a roster, it's a roster that's basically been built by the new GM Ryan Poles. So let's transition to him a little bit. What's your first impressions of Poles so far? We've gotten to look at him now in a couple of different scenarios. We looked at him in a draft and free agent cycle. So we got to see he was patient in free agency, stuck to his principles in the draft. We watched him go through a pretty ugly Roquan Smith contract situation. We saw how he basically stuck to his principles in that situation. And he's essentially applied whatever his philosophy is on roster building. You could see he's applying it. So what is your thoughts so far on Ryan Poles right now and kind of looking forward, short and maybe even longer term? Where do you think this team is headed with Poles as GM?
The first thing I noticed about Ryan Poles and, the difference between him and Ryan Pace, besides, their last names, first name, same, is that he's a complete antithesis of Pace. Like in everything, we've seen it in, how he addressed the draft, right? He's someone that wants to, build up that draft capital, and he wants to, add to his picks instead of Ryan Pace. He really loved to trade up and just kind of trade picks. But, you kind of see Poles like that. And also how he's open with the media and how he's not hiding, which we've seen Ryan Pace do on occasion, right? Ryan Poles made himself available on several occasions, including after Roquan Smith requested to be traded, right? That was the biggest thing that stood out to me, was like, oh, wow, he's actually going to stand up there and address it. He gave his little statement and then he walked off, but he actually addressed the statement. He addressed the situation, unlike Ryan Pace, who would just be hiding, that meme of him hiding behind the corner of the media room.
Classic picture. Classic.
It's amazing. And it's really refreshing. Kind of like Matt Eberflus and Matt Nagy are completely different. Ryan Poles and Ryan Pace are completely different as well. And the one thing about Ryan Poles, and I kind of said it like all off season, is so far. Well, I mean, I think we have a better understanding now. But like when he first came in, it was really hard to know like who was Ryan Poles, like what are his tendencies, what is he going to do? And we've seen like Ryan Pace, for example, kind of sign players to contracts, kind of expensive contracts. Eddie Jackson, right, is one. And then you kind of see how Ryan Poles is handling the whole Roquan Smith situation, which I think we can all agree that he should be re-signed. But, Ryan Poles is really sticking to his guns and, trying to do things his way. He's not going to back down, whether that's because, he's the new guy in town and he wants to kind of look like, hey, I know what I'm doing, right? You're not going to push me around kind of thing. But, Ryan Poles just kind of, like I said, really just, sticking to his standards and like what he wants to do. This is his team. We saw it in how he rebuilt the entire roster, essentially, almost. And he's doing it his way. And he understands this is not something he's going to turn around in one season. It's something that's going to take a few years. And he's doing it the way he's going to do it. Because, hey, if he ultimately ends up getting fired at the end of this, which, I know we hope that's not the case, then that will have happened with him doing it his way. So, I mean, I respect how he's handling it. There are some things, we might not always agree with what he's doing, but you got to respect him for doing it his way.
What about Roquan Smith? Where do you stand on this whole situation? Do you like how Poles has handled it? Do you think he should have potentially made Roquan the highest paid off-ball linebacker in the league? What's kind of your position as we enter the 2022 season? Because we know it's not going to get any prettier at the end of this season. We know it's probably going to be even more fractured if Roquan Smith has a big year and the Bears franchise him. Well, now we're talking about a doomsday scenario where probably the only reasonable outcome at that point is a trade. But I mean, we're probably headed there unless Poles midseason does some kind of big contract offer. What is your initial gut feeling on where this is going to go with Roquan? And do you like how Poles has stayed firm and kind of stayed his ground? Or do you think he should have, with all the cap space the Bears have coming up next offseason, do you think Roquan deserved to get what he thought he was worth?
Yeah, I mean, I respect Poles for what he's doing, but I kind of feel like he should pay Roquan, mostly because, listening to that preseason game that aired on ESPN and kind of listening to the commentators, which is just kind of rough, but how they kind of underestimated the importance of the weak side linebacker in Matt Eberflus's defense. I know that they don't want to pay off the ball linebackers that much, but you see like Fred Warner and Shaquille Leonard and the impacts, especially Leonard, has had in Eberflus's defense. And Roquan plays one of the most important positions in that defense. So I think that he should be paid accordingly. He's someone with, who finally made the top 100 player countdown, which is ridiculous, by the way. I thought he had made it last year. So that it's not like he's borderline top 5. He is a top 5 middle linebacker in this league. So I think that the Bears should pay him. Now, how I see it, working out, that's more challenging because I feel like Ryan Poles would want to get a deal done before the start of the season. He keeps kind of reiterating his insistence that he wants to sign Roquan. But he did say ultimately he's going to do what's best for the team. And what's best for the team is ultimately what he chooses. So is he comfortable paying Roquan however much he's demanding? Which I still think it would be better for Roquan and all sides involved if he got an agent. I just think that would be for the best. Maybe Roquan, maybe not having an agent has made things a little bit more difficult in that situation. This is me basically saying I have no idea what's going to happen.
Right. And I think that's been the big problem, right? I think when you look at the position Ryan Poles is in, this will be one of the biggest contracts he's going to negotiate for the Bears, a homegrown draft pick, second contract, big money, possibly market resetting contract for a position that he's going to have in probably the foreseeable future. We'll talk about a few guys who are coming up at the end of next season who probably are going to, one, definitely David Montgomery's on an expiring contract, and Darnell Mooney is going to finish his third season, making him eligible for a new deal. But Roquan's contract, even with the wide receiver market, would result in a bigger contract negotiation than even Darnell Mooney. Roquan not having an agent blows my mind. Like, I understand players have advisors, players have marketing firms, players have lawyers, players have a team around them that they trust, but they have to understand a very basic thing. Those unless they're certified by the NFLPA, They cannot negotiate a contract on your behalf. So essentially, all communication has to go through the player. And even just for purposes of efficiency, even if Roquan receives the offer from Poles and lets his trusted advisors review it, it's like the telephone game. There's too many people that this is going through to have actual communication, efficient negotiations to where a deal could possibly get done. And as we've read in a lot of these articles and just from Ryan Poles himself, emotions get involved. If Ryan Poles tells Roquan Smith directly what he thinks he's worth, that's never going to end well because players always think they're worth more than they really are. So you need an agent, you need the intermediary who you could speak to and have business discussions and let the agent be the facilitator for the communication with the player. This is a disaster. And it doesn't seem like it's going to change. I don't think Roquan's going to suddenly hire an agent and as he goes into free agency. Maybe he will. But personally, I don't think this ends well. I don't think Roquan Smith is a Bear in 2023. I think Roquan Smith might have an Allen Robinson type of season this year where if he plays 13 games, I think that'll be a lot. A tight hamstring that maybe he'd play through on a new contract. He's going to sit. A strained calf, maybe a pec muscle that's not feeling right. He's going to sit, and you can't blame him. His body is his asset. His greatest asset is his body. He cannot go into 2023 as damaged goods. So I don't think this is going to end well for the Bears. I think Roquan might hurt his image a little bit because of this by the end of the season. And I think ultimately, even though I know there's some people in Bears Twitter who disagree because Ryan Poles has the power of the franchise tag, they think that the Bears hold all the cards here. If a player doesn't want to be there and the relationship is this fractured and there's no agent and there's no real strong ability to communicate, it's not going to end well. And I just think we're going to watch the final year, unfortunately, of Roquan in Chicago. But there's two guys besides Roquan, right? Roquan's not everyone. Roquan's not the whole roster. There are two other very important players who are coming up at the end of this season who we got to look at this whole Roquan Smith scenario and kind of play it forward and see what we think Ryan Poles will do. The two guys I want to talk to you about, Alyssa, are David Montgomery, running back. It's kind of comparable to the linebacker or safety valuation, the positional value. You don't want to overpay for an inside linebacker. You don't want to overpay for a running back. If that's the theory that's been applied to Roquan Smith, I mean, I think it's safe to say that the same theory is going to be applied to David Montgomery. And then you have Darnell Mooney, who is going to be finishing his third season. If he goes back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons and he scores maybe 6 or 7 touchdowns, you're talking about a guy who after 3 years, resume to resume, he's a Terry McLaurin. Same guy, same stats, same production, same role and value in an offense. Terry McLaurin just got a monster contract. So two-part question. Number one, do you think David Montgomery is in his final year in a Bears uniform? And number two, do you think and this has a condition to it, if Darnell Mooney has a Terry McLaurin-like Washington Commanders season that he had last year, do you think he's the kind of player that Ryan Poles will open the checkbook and give him that $19-20 million, whatever the market is now, per year salary to a wide receiver?
Oh, good questions. So starting with Montgomery, I think a lot of that has to do with the performance of Khalil Herbert and Trestan Ebner this season, because as we know, running backs are probably the most expendable player in the NFL. You can draft them, pretty low. The Bears got Montgomery in the 3rd round, and he turned out to be, their lead back for the last 3 years. So, I mean, David Montgomery and what he means to this team, obviously we'll get to see him a lot more in this offense. I feel like this offense is going to be great for him. And he's probably going to have a big year, even though he's going to be sharing the workload with Khalil Herbert and a little bit with Ebner. So I do think it has to do with the performances of the other running backs on the roster, because if they can, get through this and be like, okay, hey, Khalil Herbert, Trestan Ebner, Darrington Evans, even though he's going to be a free agent this offseason, if they do have the running backs there, why pay David Montgomery? Although it's interesting to kind of see too how the two different dynamics of how Montgomery and Roquan are handling their contract situations, where Roquan is kind of openly just kind of being, okay, hey, I'm disrespected, pay me, I've been busting my ass, give me my money. And Montgomery's like, what's ever meant to happen will happen. So I found that really interesting. But I mean, my gut's telling me that Montgomery's probably not on the team next year, just because I feel like Ryan Poles is someone who could probably, he knows he can turn to the draft and get a running back. So depending on how much, I guess, Montgomery's market would be worth too, unless, he really does carve out a really nice role for himself in this offense and they can get like a hometown discount a little bit with him, which, I don't know, running backs especially want to get paid. So my gut's telling me no at this point. So I guess we'll see. But with Mooney, that one's very interesting because you're right. You see Terry McLaurin and he gets a lot of like the accolades, but Darnell Mooney had a really great season too last year, even had some better numbers. And we've seen already the impact of Mooney and Justin Fields, right? You have your hopeful franchise quarterback in place. You have his obvious number one weapon. The two have hung out, like they've been inseparable pretty much. And that chemistry is undeniable. And, now we get to see it this year for the first time. So if they really go off, like I think we all expect them to, if you're Ryan Poles, how do you not be like, okay, wow, that's my number one or number two receiver. That's one of Fields' guys. I got to help my quarterback out. So, I think that Ryan Poles would be more willing to open his checkbook for Mooney than possibly Roquan Smith.
And Alyssa, I'm just going to, as I do my long-winded analysis here, get a little bit of crackling feedback from your mic. I don't know if there's a way to maybe like disconnect and reconnect while I talk as the Bears talker that I am. So the running back, let's talk about the running back. I look at this, the same kind of thing with the Roquan Smith stuff. Good football players are good football players. You need 11 guys on offense. You need 11 guys on defense. And I understand that you might not want to overpay for a position that seems replaceable, a player who, you could find linebackers and running backs more easily than left tackles and quarterbacks, obviously. But if the Chicago Bears want to rebuild a culture and they want to rebuild a winning culture, you need more than just left tackles and quarterbacks and wide receivers. You need the guys that'll do the dirty work too. So do you open the checkbook for players that can be easily replaced in the middle rounds of the draft? I understand the theory that says no, replace them. But it isn't easy to replace a guy. Roquan Smith was a top 10 pick for a reason. The dude is an elite football player. David Montgomery, on the other hand, love him. Culture guy, hard runner, Chicago guy, will bring fans to their feet, will build momentum on offense. But, does the offense miss a beat when Khalil Herbert's in the game? Ebner looked the part in preseason. Do we really think that even if like the Bears had to start Darrington Evans, I don't think he's going to make the roster, but if they started Darrington Evans for 2 or 3 games, that he's not going to have production? I mean, he was a damn good college football prospect. And next year's draft, they'll, just like they replaced Jordan Howard, who was a 5th round or 4th round pick, with David Montgomery, they can replace David Montgomery with the next Jordan Howard or David Montgomery. So if the Bears are going to be cheap, I could see them being cheap at running back. Wide receiver is a different story. I mean, I think the ultimate team building philosophy for Ryan Poles going into next offseason would be, and I do think this played into his decision a little bit this year to avoid wide receiver in free agency and in the second round of the draft. He obviously likes Darnell Mooney. He knows Darnell Mooney has the right character makeup and he is a culture guy. He knows Darnell Mooney has the bond with Justin Fields, and he knows Darnell Mooney's going to ask for a new deal at the end of the season. You sign him. He's the big free agent signing. Darnell Mooney is the big money guy, and you keep him in-house. And you could do exactly, not that you want to be like the Washington Commanders. They're not a role model franchise. But you can do what they did this year. They re-signed Terry McLaurin to a massive contract extension, and they drafted Jahan Dotson in the first round. Now, the only problem with the Commanders is they don't have a quarterback. Carson Wentz, we'll see, but they don't have a quarterback. If you take that exact same team-building philosophy and apply it to the Bears, and you re-sign Darnell Mooney, who is there, Terry McLaurin, and you draft a wide receiver in the first round of next year's NFL draft, now you suddenly are cooking with gas on offense, and you fixed wide receiver with 1 big free agent deal instead of 2, and you invested a high draft pick in the guy to complement Mooney, which is basically how you have to do it these days. So I see Darnell Mooney coming back with the big money deal, and he deserves it. I mean, to me, and you talk about elite route running, you talk about players who have that special it factor quality to their game. He's that guy. You're not going to find the 6'4" DK Metcalfs all that easily. You're not going to find the physical AJ Browns who run after the catch like elite running backs all that easily. And you can't find elite route runners like Darnell Mooney all that easily. I think he's going to have a monster year, and I think he's going to earn that huge payday. The third preseason game, Alyssa, we're going to see Justin Fields throwing to Darnell Mooney, a lot longer than we probably expected to. The Bears play the Cleveland Browns on Saturday. I don't know when all you Bears talkers out there are going to be listening to this, but hopefully before the game on Saturday. If not, let's pray to the football gods that you're not listening to this after an injury was suffered on Saturday. But Matt Eberflus said on Tuesday that the Bears starters are going to get a lot of reps. They're going to play into basically to halftime, including Justin Fields. Without even thinking, Alyssa, what's the first thing that comes out of your mouth when you hear that? What's the gut feeling? What's the football instincts telling you when you hear Matt Eberflus saying that?
Oh crap! Like, I mean,
Fair,
I understand. Fair. Yeah, it's fair.
And I'm glad you said crap. I don't have to put the explicit warning on the podcast.
I'm like,
see, folks, that's a true pro, right? Even censored at the right time. Well done, Alyssa.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, obviously we're worried about injuries because this is the last preseason game. We're almost to the finish line, week 1 coming up. So obviously that's the first thing that you worry about because we're used to with the last preseason game, when there were still 4 to the starters, sitting out the entire game, right? Not really risking injury. But on the other hand, I do see the benefit of having the starters play for a half, especially the offense. When you look at it, we forget that because they had that short week, they didn't play a lot in that second game. So the offense has had the starting offense has had, I think, 28 snaps together, which you need a little bit more because we don't want to see a lot of that rust and whatnot in the first week against San Francisco with that defense bearing down on Justin Fields. So, I mean, I do get the benefit. I see the benefit of having them play that first half. Roquan Smith finally going to get a chance to be out there at weak side linebacker in that 4-3 defense in live action for the first time. So I do see the benefit of it. But then at the same time, in the back of my mind, I'm terrified. There's a risk. There's always a risk, just like there's always a risk in the regular season. So, it's going to make that last preseason game a heck of a lot more interesting. And like you said, we're just going to be praying, please, no injuries. And don't keep them out there longer than they need to be.
For us Bears content creators, it's great because there's more Justin Fields. We might get some David Montgomery. Some starting, takeaways for the offensive line, takeaways from the starters on the offensive line. It'll make our lives a little easier for a game that otherwise would be, with all due respect to the back end of the roster guys fighting for their football futures. The later portion of that Bears Seahawks game was borderline torture to try to consume so that you can write something from an informed perspective. At least we'll get a full half of fun football to watch before the preseason is officially over. I'm old enough to remember, like you said, Alyssa, the third preseason game used to be known as the dress rehearsal. And starters would actually play into the third quarter. So they get the feel for coming out of halftime and still having to play football. So I think Matt Eberflus is showing his old school tendency with this. He's been coaching a long time. He coached through, obviously, an era where players played that the starters used the third preseason game as that dress rehearsal game. So I think he's still applying that, especially since Chicago has a week off between the last preseason game and the season opener. So I think if there is, unfortunately, a tweak, a sprain, a pulled muscle here or there, you do have that extra week for recovery. So that probably plays into it. And sometimes major injuries are just a product of bad luck. And I don't think a guy playing, at the 8-minute mark of the second quarter, if he was destined to get injured, I mean, honestly, it probably would have happened with 8 minutes left in the second quarter of the first game. Maybe that's me just, again, wishing to the football stars and the gods of whatever you pray to that we don't suffer any injuries on Thursday. But I think on Saturday, but I think it's good for Justin Fields. Hopefully the offense does build a little bit of momentum, has a good drive or two, scores a touchdown, and can go into the opener against San Francisco with a little bit of mojo, a little bit of confidence, a little bit of swagger, because you don't want, the opposite could be true too, Alyssa, right? We could be sitting here and the Bears look atrocious in the first half against the Browns and Justin Fields throws an interception or two. David Montgomery puts the ball on the ground. And Darnell Mooney can't shake a Browns cornerback. And it's just like doomsday. And now all confidence is lost. So, doesn't always work. Playing starters longer than they should in the preseason doesn't mean the goal will be accomplished. It could backfire for reasons beyond injury. So the Bears have to bring their A game. And I'm glad that Eberflus is treating this like a game week. Hopefully that does build some positive momentum into the regular season. Enough about the Bears on the field. Alyssa, we did get a question for you on Twitter today when I announced that you would be a guest. So I want to bring this one up. It's from @just_AC. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce it. Really fun follow on Twitter. He's a big Bears fan. And he asked the following question. This is word for word, copy paste. What's been the most challenging thing for you covering the Bears? And he wants you to give the listeners a cool story, whether it's, I'm assuming he means about your Bears coverage. So the mic is yours.
Okay. I think,
I'll put the question back on so you can see it.
Oh, appreciate that.
Yeah.
As a former teacher, I like seeing it written down. So I think the most challenging thing is probably covering some of the bigger events that you really need multiple people for. And I know you know this, Bryan. Like the NFL draft and free agency are just kind of, and roster cuts, which, hey, we're in the middle of that. Next Tuesday is going to be really interesting. So like kind of covering those big events, I think, has really been the most challenging thing. But, I'm lucky to have a good group of contributors that are here to help, and lucky that I've been blessed to have.
Shout out to Brendan.
Shout out to Brendan. He is amazing.
Awesome dude. Awesome follow on Twitter. Yeah. I don't have his Twitter handle available, but I'll drop it in the comments or the description on the YouTube video once that's posted. He's a good dude. He worked, I was part of the Bears Wire staff. I worked alongside him as well. He has his own Bears podcast going. So make sure you check out the description on the YouTube video for his Twitter account. He's a very, very high-level Bears analyst, and he's Alyssa's co-managing editor. I mean, I don't know what he got upgraded, leveled up.
Yes, he got a promotion. He's my assistant editor now. So
that's awesome.
We came in at the same time. I think he actually started the day before me. I think I started on April Fool's Day, which was just hilarious to me. I'm like, oh gosh. But yeah,
no joke. It turned out to not be a joke, right?
It didn't. I like it. It's kind of like a reverse kind of mojo thing. I'm like, the universe is like, psych, don't worry, you're fine. So yeah, I think that's probably the most challenging thing. And I guess back when I wasn't doing it full time, like kind of when breaking news had happened. Okay, I think I remember telling you this one time when you were still writing for the site, where anytime when I'm in a car is when news tends to break all the time. Whether it's training camp or signings or someone getting cut, and I'm like, darn.
It's like very real. Like people who don't do what we do don't understand the anxiety that creates. Right? Yeah. I remember I was in Boston for a group friend's birthday weekend, and it was right in the middle of free agency. And it was probably either my first or second year doing Bears Wire. And it was when the Bears signed Jarrell Freeman, the linebacker from the Colts. That was like a big signing at the time. And I was in a bar at a table with all my friends, round of beers, and I'm sitting there on my phone, writing the article on the WordPress app on my phone, because you just feel that you can't miss the story, right, Alyssa? And I think that's what separates. Like, I'm going to go off on a tangent now, okay? I'm taking the mic and I'm going off on a tangent now. That's what separates the bloggers and the Bears content creators from the beat writers. And with all due respect to the beat writers, they're great at what they do. They're professionally trained. They go to Halas Hall and they cover the team in that space and in that bucket. But what the content creators, the bloggers, the whatever you want to call them, there is such a deeper level of passion for getting the news and the story out to the Bears fans that it literally controls in a way what you're doing and when you're doing it. And to me, that's like the drive and the passion to be great at something is what separates Bears Wire. Why a website like Bears Wire, if you search any Bears related subject in Google, Bears Wire is going to dominate before the Chicago Tribune, before the Chicago Sun-Times, before ESPN. Before a lot of these big media, bigger Chicago outlets, a site like Bears Wire appears first. Why? Because it matters so much to someone like you, Alyssa, to someone like me, to someone like Brendan, to the people who put their time and effort, sweat, blood, and tears, maybe not blood, but some tears for sure, into creating a consistent hub for Bears fans to enjoy. You go on Bears Wire, you are going to have every single story covered from so many different angles. And what when I see on Twitter or some of these other social media platforms, when beat writers kind of look down upon the bloggers or content creators who do things like a Bears Wire or a Bears Talk or a Windy City Gridiron or whatever else is out there that kind of falls into that fan site space, I just shake my head, because the people who are the most critical of those types of outlets are the ones who would never, ever, ever be able to do it. So I'm off my soapbox now, Alyssa. You can continue with whatever thought I'm sure I ripped out of your mind and you've long forgotten now, because you're probably thinking about the next 7 articles you have to write for Bears Wire.
Oh my gosh, always. I already have several already in the mind. It's always
awesome.
going.
That's so
Which,
funny.
like what you're saying, like that fear is real too, like the passion, and like that's happened to me so many times too, even as recently as Saturday when, I was like, okay, so it's a closed practice, so you don't have to be vigilant as much. I think I had one person kind of just looking over things. And then all of a sudden, I'm having a couple drinks and, oh, Roquan Smith practiced for the first time. Oh, crap. Oh, Roquan's meeting with the media. Oh, my God.
The biggest story of the summer.
The biggest story of the
Out of
summer. And I'm
nowhere.
like, okay. When I decided to take a break. But yeah, like those kind of stories are pretty crazy. And like, I remember like I pulled off the highway before to write stories because like I get it on my watch and I just see a word. I'm like, oh no. Every time my phone beeps, I'm like, oh gosh, please don't be the Bears. I just put my computer away. I want to lay down for a moment. Like you totally get the struggle, Fred.
I totally. It's very real. It's very real, and it's why when I feel like this slice of the industry, when it doesn't feel like it gets the respect it deserves, it really angers me. I feel like sometimes I want to be a frontline soldier for everybody that I know goes through what I've gone through, what you're going through, what all the good folks at Windy City Gridiron and Bear Goggles on and all the other fan sites go through.
So many great ones.
They are, they all deserve a big pat on the back because they make being a Bears fan fun. And speaking of fun, there's one other question we got on Twitter from actually the same Bears fan at @just_AC. And if it's not AC, then I apologize. I don't know how else to pronounce it. He asked, and we could both answer this. It's a good way to close the show. What are your expectations on the season? Do we think the Bears can actually sneak in to the playoffs as a wild card? You're going first on this one.
Darn. Oh man, he used the P word. Playoffs. That's a big one. Oh man.
That's a real big one.
So I'm trying to go into this season with kind of just no expectations in a sense, because it's a new regime, it's a mostly new roster. Obviously there are plenty of areas that still need improvement. I think the most important thing this year is Justin Fields' development, and I think if we look back on this season and he's taken that step forward, and we'll be able to quantify that in a specific way, we'll know. Especially when you look at what he's working with this year, unless they go out and sign some big name receiver, which that's not happening. So I think as long as he kind of takes that step forward and has a good season, that it will be a winning season. Do I think they could sneak into the playoffs? Well, I'm not going to rule anything out, because back in 2018, I didn't think the Bears were going to the playoffs. I was a teacher and I told my students, I'm like, because I thought they were going to have a losing season. When the Bears win, there's no homework. Guess what? There were 12 Mondays when those kids had no homework. Did not think that was going to happen.
That's a good year to be in your class.
That was a great year. And I actually ran into one of those students the other day, and he still remembers me for the Bears. He's like, yeah, we're all Bears fans. And
you made a lot of Bears fans. You made a lot of kids Bears fans that year.
I did. I totally did. They were rooting for him because they knew they had no homework. So, but yeah, looking at this season, they do have a favorable schedule. I mean, when I see people talking about how they're going to be one of the worst teams in the league, I'm kind of like, really? I mean, there are some pretty bad teams in the league. I'm like, do we really think they're going to be worse than a Houston? Like, I mean, and then the Jets with Zach Wilson being hurt, even though it's not long term. There's just a lot of teams out there that I think are in a similar boat to the Bears. And I don't think they're going to be one of the worst. I think they have a good head coach in Matt Eberflus. Like I said before, I think he's someone that's going to push them to get a couple extra wins out of this team. Again, playoffs. I'm not saying playoffs right now, but I'm not ruling it out entirely. I kind of had them going 6-10. 6-11 now. My bad. Get used to that 17th game. 6-11, maybe 7-10. I'm gonna start there.
So, very fair. Everything you said is very fair. And I basically agree. But last year, this time, if this question was asked to a Bengals Talk podcast, we would have had the same analysis. Joe Burrow coming back from injury, breaks out, has a huge year, and Jamar Chase was obviously a big part of that. And the Bears don't have a Jamar Chase, but I would not rule out whether or not the Bears have a Joe Burrow. Justin Fields is just as talented of a quarterback, in my opinion, as Joe Burrow. Does Justin Fields have enough weapons to bring all of that out in 2022? Joe Burrow in 2021 not only had Jamar Chase, he had T. Higgins, he had Boyd, he had Joe Mixon in the backfield. His offensive line was terrible, but he had the skill players to do all the damage once they had the ball in their hands. And we'll see whether or not the supporting cast for Fields just isn't up to snuff to be able to handle their part of the equation, make plays after he gets you the ball. But the NFL is crazy. The NFL is the most unpredictable season in all of sports. We always see every year the turnover with playoff teams. Teams that are supposed to be terrible sneak in as a wild card. Teams that are supposed to be great end up picking in the top 15 in the NFL draft. We don't know what's going to happen, but I will say this. A tried and true, tested, winning formula is good coaching, sound defense, and good quarterback play. I think the Bears are going to have the coaching. I think they're going to have the good quarterback play. And I think this defense is going to be a lot better than fans realize right now. The secondary is significantly upgraded. Robert Quinn will still bring the pass rush. Roquan Smith is back on the second level. I think the defense is going to do their part. That will keep them in games. And as long as you're in the game, anything's possible. But I don't think they're making the playoffs. I think they're probably going to be around that same record as you think, Alyssa, maybe a little closer to 500. But I think we're going to be in a position where Bears fans end the year feeling really good about this team, feeling really good about the offseason coming up with a lot of money to spend in free agency, back in the first round, possibly trade opportunities with players that they might want to unload. The future will be bright as long as QB1 takes that next step. Speaking of that next step, everybody listening to this podcast has to do a couple of things. Number one, you have to go to bearstalk.com, check out the site. You need to sign up, contribute your own content if you desire, if you want to break in and be the next Alyssa Barbieri. There is not going to be a next Alyssa Barbieri, but you can at least try. You need to go to bearswire.com to see why she's going to be so hard to, often imitated, never duplicated. Follow her on Twitter. She'll give you all her specifics in a minute. I'm at Bryan Perez NFL on Twitter. The website at The Bears Talk. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts. Go on YouTube. Subscribe, like, do whatever, the normal podcaster says you got to do at the end of every show. Alyssa, where can everybody find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Alyssa Barbieri, and you can find my work over at bearswire.usatoday.com.
Make sure you do it, Bears fans. Make sure you come back to this podcast. Make sure you're subscribed, like, rate, review. I'm fully expecting all of the Bears Wire faithful, all of the Alyssa Barbieri, those fans, 5-star rating, leave a great review. We appreciate it. Alyssa appreciates it. The podcast appreciates it. Let's bear down together, have a really fun season. And I think, call it a hunch, Alyssa's going to be back again real soon to talk Bears here on the Bears Talk podcast. Catch you next time.